All right. So, as I said, thank you for inviting me. I was working in Bremen, and I come from a slightly different background than many other here, because I'm not really a roboticist in the classical sense, or in any sense, really, if I put it this way. I'm originally a cognitive scientist that ended up doing a PhD in theoretical computer science. So very sort of theory heavy, a bit, how to formally model knowledge and things like this. So in the line of logic and knowledge representations and stuff like this. When I was doing my PhD, which was a couple of years ago, or a little bit longer now, I got very interested in the notion of how do we actually form our thoughts and our minds and stuff like this, and how do we construct the foundation for new knowledge and new concepts and stuff like this. And I realized that this was something that you can use for many different things, right? So there was a long journey that ended up basically taking me into the robotics field, where you basically have this beautiful foundation for how to basically test theoretical ideas in a practical environment. So this was why I was very excited to work in Bremen and still be working with a lot of the collaborators that I have in Bremen. So this talk will take you ideally a little bit through a journey of those different topics. But I thought I'd start with this idea. So we wrote a paper quite recently about, this notion of how to create more interesting reasoning abilities in robotics. And one of the things that we claimed in this paper was that one of the main reasoning tasks for robots is to infer how movements lead to certain changes in the environment. It's like the robot is an embodied agent, and the way it moves its body somehow affects the environment, just like it does for us humans, right? For us, it's easier because we have more experience, perhaps, with different things. But for the robot, it's important that it understands, if I lift the cup and then drop, let it go, it will fall to the ground, and these kind of things, right? So movement is something that's very, very essential for the robotics field. And I was thinking of this because there's such a beautiful analogy, or a beautiful sort of continuation from basically what neuroscientists are talking about when it comes to the human brain. And there's this very strong claim that the entire brain, or the way that the brain is so sophisticated, and the fact that we have such a range of skills when it comes to manipulating movement, this is really the reason why the brain was developed in the way that it was. And this is something that Daniel Wolpert has been doing a lot of research on, and he's one of the world's most famous neuroscientists at the moment, working on sensory motor processes in the brain, and also with computational methods and stuff like this. So I find this kind of interesting because it leads into this notion of, okay, if we then assume that movement is something that is very essential for how we, for the brain development, and the brain development basically was the way we think and the way we structure things, it leads to a very nice intersection between, cognitive science and more applied reasoning tasks for robotics. And if you go to cognitive science, you have this, history of many different ways of looking at how cognition actually develops and how cognition behaves. And most recently, so the past few decades, or up to 4, I would say, this has been the most predominant hypothesis, is called the embodied cognition hypothesis. And this is actually a network or a family of different theories that ranges from very, loosely interpreted to very hardcore interpreted. But the general idea is that it is because we have a physical body that perceives and interacts with its environment that we can actually create any kind of mental concepts to begin with. So it puts a lot of emphasis on the sensory motor processes, and as the sort of foundation for constructing, conceptual spaces, but also how we do reasoning. And you can find this in developmental psychology, where they've been investigating how kids basically develop, an understanding for their environment. But you can also look at this from a very sort of top-down perspective when you look in linguistics, for example. So natural language is one of those areas which we believe is sort of the easiest way to look into the conceptualizations of people, right? And we use a lot of spatial language or embodied metaphors in our natural language. So we say things like falling into a coma or falling asleep. It's very rarely the case that you fall asleep, like you fall into it, right? But because we are usually sleeping in a horizontal position, and falling sort of leads to horizontal position, there's some sort of foundation there that you can build on. And then you can take this through many different areas of just how we conceptualize things and how we verbalize different concepts, like a career ladder and things like this, where we have this very clear vertical hierarchy in terms of how we perceive things. Now, what I was always very interested was in this, like, okay, if we have this sort of grounded cognition idea that it is through our bodies that we construct mental concepts about the environment that we have, this becomes sort of a way to solve the symbol grounding problems, which is, one of these prototypical problems that we have in artificial intelligence. This idea that we have real world objects that have symbol representation in language or art or dance or symbols or facial features, facial expressions, all of these things are somehow things that we can identify in other things, and we somehow can communicate through these symbols to refer to the same thing in the world, and at the same time understand it in our minds, right? And if we assume that the embodied cognition has some sort of foundation to it, ideally, we should be able to integrate this into a embodied system for robotics, right? So this is where these things comes in. Now, if you're looking at this from the mental idea of the bridge between perception and interaction with the environment and the mental representation, this is not entirely clear. How would you do this? So in the 80s, or in the late 80s to be even, they started sort of investigating this notion of image schemas. And this is it's not really clear exactly how to define these, because this is something that's been studied in cognitive linguistics and developmental psychology, neuroscience, and most recently artificial intelligence. But simply put, you can think of them as this sort of step between the embodied experience and the way that we structure our mental representations, right? Johnson, who is one of the introducer of this sort of hypothesis, or this kind of framework of thinking, he said that an image schema is a recurring dynamic pattern of our perceptual interactions and motor programs that gives coherence and structure to our experience. This is a bit dense. I'm sure you feel the same. It's not really clear what this actually means. And this is probably part intention and part unfortunate, if we put it this way. But the idea is basically that we have these mental abstractions from our interactions with the world, right? So we create generalizations from the experiences that we have, and then we use them for things like natural language expressions, or for analogical reasoning in how different objects works and stuff like this. Usually when we talk about these things in the formal setting, we have been quite... we've decided to try to core this down a little bit and not allow ourselves the full range of this potentiality to this concept. And often we talk about spatiotemporal relationships. This is also very broad, and it could mean a lot of different things, but it gives us at least the starting point to try to approach these abstract mental patterns in a way that could be formally realizable. Right? So then you would have the spatial dimension, and you would have a temporal dimension in which things can move, or there can be object transformations, or things like this. So 3 prototypical examples for this would be containment, the notion that things can be inside other objects. We see this all around us all the time. Another one is the concept of support. Kids learned this also very early, that if you place a cup on a table, it will remain there. And then, of course, source path goal is the notion that objects can move from one place to another. Right? And these might seem super intuitive and super simple to sort of conceptualize. And this is ultimately the whole point of this. We want them to be these atomic little descriptors for certain kinds of object behavior or object affordances that they can actually execute these kinds of things, right? if you think about natural language, you can find them in something that's called conceptual metaphors. And if you're a linguist, you probably know what this is, but if you're not, this might be new to you. So conceptual metaphors is a little bit larger term than just metaphors. It's about taking information from one domain and applying it onto another domain. So a classic one would be up is good. This is a very common analogy or a very common conceptual metaphor that we have in the West, especially, where we have concepts like, heaven is above us, hell is below us. We have expressions like we're high in spirits when we're very happy. We have, of course, the career ladder and the rise to power. Fall from grace would be the opposite, but it would be based on the same thing. And if you start coring this down, the way we conceptualize our world in this sort of metaphoric framework, we can, of course, find a spatiotemporal structure behind this. And in this particular case, it's not a very complicated one. It's just a notion of verticality, the notion that there is an up and that there is a down, and that things can go up and down somehow. And then on top of this sort of skeleton of information, we just put all kinds of conceptual information and restructure it based on this schematic notion somehow. And this is just one example, but you can find many like this where we do this. It's not the whole truth of how we think, but there is definitely something to be found here. Something that is probably a bit more easy to accept when you're a roboticist or when you're working with embodied agents is the notion of affordances. I'm sure you've all heard about this. And this is the, simply put, it's the things you can do with certain objects in certain environments. Right? These are the affordances. And it's been proposed that this is really the functionality of object is the object. Right? Imagine if you have a coffee cup that does not have the containment function. If you have a picture of a coffee cup that can't contain any liquids or anything else at all, then maybe it's not really a cup somehow. So you have this way of thinking of objects and many things in terms of their affordances. And ultimately, you can describe them also in terms of their sort of the schematic thing that in collection sort of give rise to these affordances somehow. So once again, there's sort of an schematic skeleton underneath the affordances in most cases. The second thing is the conceptual spaces that I have on this one. It's basically the same thing, but it allows you to think about larger concepts, especially in terms of metaphoric concepts or abstract concepts, right? So if I ask you to conceptualize transportation, I visualize it here with a truck, but you couldn't technically do this in many ways. Transportation would be anything, inside something going somewhere else, right? And if you core it down again, you get to the spatial relationships of just containment and source path goal function, right? As in addition to each other, right? So in this composition, these two image schemas together would represent the way that we conceptualize transportation. So there's a lot of potentiality here in terms of just how we conceptualize things by sort of identifying these core building blocks. I wanted to show this as well. So when we talk about reasoning, one of the most common ways to do reasoning in the human world is to do analogical reasoning. And it's even been proposed that this is the way that the human mind works entirely. We learn through analogies. We structure our entire world based on analogical reasoning. And just for the sake of having said it, it's basically making these mappings between one object and another. So here, for example, we have this coffee cup again, which we know is a container because we pour coffee in it every morning and every afternoon and probably several times in between. At least I do. And we know that this has certain properties. And because we have those properties, we can map these properties onto similar objects, right? Here we have a flower pot. And if we know that the properties are similar, we can infer that the pot also probably has a containment function, right? The flower pot is a slightly different example because, of course, it has a hole in it. So if you pour liquid in it, it probably won't stay. But you can still put flowers in it and stuff like this, right? So if the coffee cup is a container for coffee, the flower pot becomes a container for flowers. right? So this is basically how this would work in terms of analogical reasoning. And you can imagine that this would be very interesting for things like tool substitution, and reasoning about unknown objects by basically extracting the potential properties they have and then inferring the affordances and the imischematic relationships that they sort of offer through these things somehow. I will just mention this briefly because this is sort of something that I'm very passionate about, and this is the notion of creativity. So there's also this idea of conceptual blending, which is a sort of slightly more advanced version of analogy, in which basically two conceptual spaces merge together and create something novel, right? And if you look at this from the perspective of an analogy, where you need to have this shared structure of one or another kind, for creative construction, you can find this as well. So this is the prototypical boat house one, where you can identify that both the boat and a house has the containment relationship. And then you automatically assume also that the houseboat, which is the blended space of this somehow, it has the functionality of both the boat and the house to be a container, and also a boat based on the fact that it can move somehow, right? So you have this quite interesting sort of notion behind these sort of puzzle pieces that you can sort of put together in some really interesting ways and create rather complex things. But going back a little bit more to the sort of immediate robotic space, one thing that I know that EASE is working a lot with is this notion of giving instructions to robots. This is a very important aspect if you want to create robots that can function within the sort of framework of a household or a functional environment like that. So something like bring the cup to the table would be a very reasonable thing to ask a robot to do. And in order to do that, the robot needs to have certain kinds of understanding of what this means. And if you look at it from the imischematic sort of level, you know that there's the verb bring something to something, or bring something to a location in this case, This would be a source path goal very clearly. You would have the cup here, which is the container. And because it's a container for liquids in this particular case, there's certain kinds of rules for containers, right? You have to keep it vertically up in order for the content to remain inside. And then you know that the table is a supporter based on the properties that it has a flat surface and it has a certain level of sturdiness to it. Which basically means that the cup is supposed to be put on the table and not next to it or under it or something like this, right? So you have this kind of information built into also these sentences, right? And you can do this on a quite a large scale. So people in linguistics have looked at this quite a lot, but not on a very sort of implemented level or on a sort of extended level in which you can put it to use for robotics or something like this. But this is definitely something really quite interesting. Now, obviously, all of this is very sort of cognitive sciencey and not so easy to somehow figure out how you would turn this into something that can be machine readable. And there's not really one answer to these questions, I would say. You could probably do this in many different ways. And I am not a Puritan in any way when it comes to this. If you can do this in a completely innovative way, I think you should, totally embrace that, because there is only possibilities here, But ideally, we want to somehow create some sort of way in which it's possible to take these abstract patterns and turning them into something that would be machine readable, right? So in order to do this, I had the privilege of working with some really smart people from my PhD, and we were sort of starting to think about these abstract notions and started to structure them in a way in which it would be possible for us to look at them not as these abstract patterns that could be potentially super meaningful for the way people think, blah, 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 but actually say, okay, this is what they are. This is what they need, and this is how you would structure them. And if you do this, something like this, a computer can understand it. So the first thing we did was that we, allowed ourselves to basically dissect these atomic concepts, right? So the image schemas are supposed to be little components that are atomic in themselves. But if you start looking at them, you can actually see that they have components of an even more, basic level than their compositions, right? So take, for example, containment. It's very hard to imagine a container that doesn't have an outside, or a container that doesn't have a border between its inside and its outside. There are examples like this. The universe, for example, would be one. We imagine that, or we conceptualize, most of us, I guess, that there is some sort of inside to the universe, and then eventually there is a border for the most outer parts of the universe, and then there just isn't anything on the other side, right? So that would be an example that at least many people conceptualize in this particular term. But at the same time, so we must be able to sort of core them down a little bit. So we did this, and I just want to zoom in a little bit to explain exactly what this means. But we started looking at them from two perspectives. This one is the relationships between objects, very, very simplified. So we have the image schematic relationships in different colors here, and then you can see how we add certain kinds of components for each level, and we inherit them from different kinds of image schematic notions from different layers. You have contact. If you add verticality to it, you can have some sort of contact in a vertical axis. If you add some sort of function, force to it, like, support, or like a force support, then you would basically be able to say, okay, a table would be able to support a cup because it has enough, force in it to support this heavy object with all the coffee inside it somehow, right? So the idea is that you would be able to take all of these things and then core it down into a very, very complex network of very simple notions, right? Where you can add and remove them a little bit like this. This is, of course, probably not entirely cognitively accurate. So this should be said, that we are making a grave simplification into these concepts simply because we don't care 100% if we're doing a cognitive mapping, but we want to see whether they actually work in a formal setting, right? The other one is the path family, which is the one between movements between objects. And I will not go into that very much, but it's the same thing as with how different relationships between objects can connect to each other. Also here, right? You can go to very different specific levels on goals and sources and how the movement is sort of executed and stuff like this, right? Naturally, this is something that we made up a little bit, but we can also find this as a motivation. So there's motivation from the real world, where we can see that these kinds of relationships exist in many forms. There's also a lot of support from cognitive linguistics and natural language, where we have a lot of different ways to express the variety of underspecified information, right? So this is something very important for giving robots instructions, for example, right? To understand which level of specificity that we are actually explaining things. And then, of course, it's also very likely that this is also something that it's real based on how developmental psychology actually works, because we fine-tune these as we learn, right? We become better and better at things. And there's a lot of interesting sort of probabilities that we can actually include some sort of machine learning methods here to basically train these things on a much more, let's call it, probabilistic and developmental kind of way somehow. Anyway, I want to just very briefly talk about the image schema logic. This is something that we developed, and it's far from perfect. There's issues with this on how to implement this in terms of the image schema formalizations and stuff like this. But we need some sort of language in order to represent these. And if you guys sit there and you think, oh, but this is how you have to do it, I'm super happy. Send me a message, because I would love that. So I want you to take this with a pinch of salt, in the sense of this is not the full truth. This is a truth that you could do it like this. And I want you to take it with you as a sort of inspiration for how you can view these things and what are the necessary components to sort of include in a sort of formal language for image schemas somehow. So we did this with the inspiration from a lot of geographical information science, which is a field that looks specifically at how different regions and objects within that region relate to each other, right? Lakes and things like the cities and stuff like this, right? And it's a combination logic with a spatial dimension, a movement dimension, there's a temporal dimension, and then we have a concept language in order for this to somehow fit into a broader scale, right? If you just describe the image schemas, that's fine, but ideally it should be somehow included so that you can talk about them also in a larger setting. For the spatial dimension, we used regional connectional calculus. It describes how basically regions relate to each other with different kinds of overlap and intersections and stuff like this, right? We also used cardinal directions, but I don't think we ever used anything except above so far. But there's also a very good reason for this, because we believe that behind can also be very important when we talk about things like object occlusions and things like this. And in order to somehow describe certain things, we also added a point of reference, and this is an egocentric view. It's made to sort of give this triangularization, right? So if object moves in relationship to each other, but not to you, you still need to be able to appreciate this, right? Which leads to the movement dimension. We incorporated a slightly simpler version of the qualitative trajectory calculus, which basically just describes relative movement between objects, right? So this is something that would be very important for an image schematic representation. A way to basically say that objects are moving closer to each other or further away from each other, and so on and so forth, right? Then we just used linear temporal logic. We assume that the mind is quite linear in the way it thinks, so we thought this was kind of fine. And then, of course, we added the concept language in first order logic, mostly because this was something that I knew sort of. But there might be other methods that might be much better than this. Just to show you how this would sort of work in terms of the way that we describe them. This was a subset of the object family, or the two object family, of particularly in this case support. If you describe this using image schema logic, it would look something like this, right? So you would basically incorporate all of these different sort of notions. And then, of course, there's a very sort of complex semantics to this, where we try to describe exactly how the objects are allowed to relate to one another and things like this. But this is just how you would write it, right? Now, obviously, this doesn't really fit 100% with the EASE project and the robots that are sort of involved. So we've been sort of working on trying to incorporate this also within the framework, and I will show some minor slides on previous or recent work that we are doing on trying to sort of cooperate or collaborate between these sort of old methods and what would be more like, I guess, vector graphics or something like this. I'm not sure exactly what that means. But anyway, the most important thing here to take with you is, if we can sort of represent these things, we can start representing increasingly complex things, right? We showed how we can represent things like a cup and things like transportation, but we can also do something like modeling events and doing this by combining image schemas, right? So here would be blockage, where you have 3 different time points, and there's certain kinds of relationships between the objects. You don't have to look at the formula so much. It's just more about understanding how this would basically, how this composition can actually describe certain events, and this is a very simple one, that you have movement, and then you have contact, and then you don't have any movement anymore, right? So we started looking into, okay, what about more real life scenarios? Like, is there any way to actually incorporate this into more the way we conceptualize things? So there's this theory and there's this work on event segmentation in cognitive science, where they're trying to sort of create a method or a sort of theory for how people actually cut events in terms of the way they conceptualize things. And so we were working a little bit on this notion of what if we can actually cut the events based on the image-schematic changes. And I think this actually makes a lot of sense. So if you have an ongoing spatiotemporal relationship that sort of remains, and we have argued that this is a fundamental core piece to how we conceptualize certain things, breaking the event into these scenes makes a lot of sense. So here, for example, we have the example of dropping an egg. And this was me hacking away a couple of years ago on, okay, well, how many image-schematic scenes are really taking place here? And I came to the conclusion that it was approximately 5. There might be some minor ones in between, but ultimately it's 5 scenes, right? It's an egg being supported. It's an egg not being supported. And then it's an egg falling down. It's an egg being in contact very briefly with the ground and stopping its movement. And then, of course, it breaks. You can argue that scene 1 and scene 2 happens more or less at the same time, and that scene 4 and scene 5 is probably also very short in terms of a temporal dimension. But ultimately, you can cut this thing into these little segments and somehow imagine that each of these segments have a lot of, semantic meaning to them, right? If you think about it. So you can, of course, formalize this, and you can turn this into image schema logic or any kind of other formal language that you think makes sense for you. This is just a way to describe how this would work, right? But this hypothesis is quite interesting in terms of just, well, can we use this for robotics in a way? Can we cut up events and reason about potential outcomes by looking at this and somehow? So this leads me to of course, image schemas and robotics. And this is work that we are, doing right now, and there's no real answers to anything here, right? This is just preliminary and, maybe this could be a great idea kind of ideas here, right? But when I was in Bremen, I had the privilege of working with some smart people who knows a lot about robots. And we started sort of hacking away at what this could possibly do. So, we were trying to somehow see this different things and see if we can use this for something meaningful. And the first area that we thought of, and that feels perhaps the most obvious, is natural language processing. We didn't do so much with this, but I think this is an area that has a lot of potential. It's basically the notion that we want to create systems that understands, and I give this sort of like the citation marks or quotation marks because, what does understand really means? It's something to also question here, right? But you would be able to provide it with things like metaphor or abstract concepts and also affordances of particular objects, right? Because you would basically be able to, extract these, spatiotemporal relationships from these terms, and then somehow be able to hack up approximately what this could mean in terms of, movement and these kind of things that are so important for robotics reasoning, right? And we can use this for something like unspecified instructions. If you're told to take the cup to the table, it's kind of useful to understand some of these underlying principles for these terms and these concepts somehow, right? The other thing that we were thinking about was like, okay, how can we use them for more smarter things, right? And it comes back to this notion of coring down events. If robots are basically made to do certain kinds of actions and certain kinds of tasks, it would be possible to somehow see if we can sort of inherit some of these common sense reasoning that comes with the image schemas, like this notion of a cup is a container, it needs a certain vertical orientation for liquids. You can't flip it over, because then the liquids would pour out and stuff like this, right? So it's a lot of built-in reasoning issues that sort of come for free through this sort of framework, right? And if you can sort of have that as part of it, you can make them a little bit smarter with this kind of thing, right? The second thing, of course, is this notion of event segmentation, right? If you can create action descriptors that are cut into reasonable pieces of actions, you can do something quite smart. I know that in ease, CRAM and SOMA and so on, they already have a quite sophisticated division of actions, but sometimes it's also this notion of like, where do you make these cuts? And this is where I think the image schematic sort of level can become very interesting as a sort of overlap and a sort of way to turn it a bit more cognitively plausible, where you would be able to sort of say that, okay, the reason why we cut the event here is because the image schematic, states of this particular scenario has changed. So now we need to start thinking of this in a different way. Now, so this was the example that I used in a previous slide, just to show you the notion of how to sort of segment different kinds of things. This is an event that happens without any actual actions, but you can also imagine that you would turn this into an action in which particular events are supposed to take place during the different scenes, right? So you're supposed to do certain actions, and that action becomes the transformation that sort of the event goes through. So this is something that we were initiating some 6 months ago, and we've been working on it since, how to basically incorporate this idea into the object affordances. So this would be on the word level, but also in the way that these objects would be formally represented, right? You would have all of these different sort of notions attached to certain kinds of objects, right? And then, of course, using the action descriptors to basically use these tools in a way, or to understand the object affordances through the object properties and sort of cut them up on the image schematic level, right? And it's still preliminary, and we don't know if this is going to work perfectly or whether it's even efficient. But the idea is basically that we can go from a linguistic instruction kind of level, and then ideally create a better understanding for how to execute certain kinds of actions. So if you know how to crack an egg, for example, you can make omelette. You can just take this as little puzzle pieces again that you can use as minor constructs that you can put together into increasingly more complex construct, right? And eventually end up at making, pancakes and, 18-tier chocolate cakes. I don't know, whatever you need eggs for, right? By taking the components from many different areas, right? And of course, you can do this in many different scenarios, right? As long as you understand the event and the context that that the robot is sort of working within. This is the last thing that I will mention in terms of potentialities to use these for. This is a paper we just wrote, and that is soon published. We will present it in December. We basically asked, is there a way to sort of use these image schematic notions within the ease framework, right? So we started looking at the notion of cutting bread, and we wanted to see, is it possible to translate some of these image schematic event, segments and into CRAM action plans and the descriptions that we have in SOMA. And it turns out that there's a lot of these things already embedded into this, right? With slightly more specific purposes for everything, right? And we started to put this in practice, right? So we did this, we wrote this paper about testing, adapting to the situation when something didn't work out. So we gave the robots a few different knives. In this particular case, it's a bit alarming really to teach robots how to use knives, but why not? Gotta start somewhere. So basically we gave the robots a few options of knives that had different kinds of properties, right? And one of them didn't have the opportunity to do cutting because it doesn't have this sort of image schematic necessities of dispositions, right? And then we put it through the reasoner in NoRob, and we wanted to see, okay, well, can it actually reason about this and sort of work around this, right? And this is something that NoRob has been doing for quite a while, so it's not particularly super, innovative in that sense. But we were trying to see if we could get this particular thing to work, right? To see if we can ideally sort of map these image schematic notions to this and see if it can reason based on this and alternate its action in some way. So we had quite a nice result, actually. It turned out that the robot did realize that it couldn't cut the bread with this knife that didn't have the cutting function. Sounds, simple maybe, but it also managed to change to another knife that did have the cutting function, and then we could actually make it cut bread for us. So this is the first stage, and we're hoping that we can turn this into a much more generalizable sort of thing, in which case it cuts, all kinds of stuff, and ideally does other actions as well. But this was just the first way to see if we can do something nice with this. This is my final science slide and the takeaway message. So for smarter robots, it's my kind of hypothesis that image schemas can help with a few things. And we wrote this sort of vision paper. So if you're interested in this, you can have a look at it, because there are a lot of cool ideas. It was predominantly me and Mihai and Robert as well, who was hacking away a little bit at this, where we structured our vision for how we could use this and the framework with image schema logic, and connect that to some of the work that's being done within ease. But our main idea is that reasoning about functional relationships can be done through image schemas, as well as reasoning about alternatives to a plan. And we showed this with the bread cutting thing in a sort of simple way. We believe that it can help with adaptability. So basically, the robot would be able to infer certain kinds of relationships and certain kinds of properties of events and stuff like this by making basically analogies from one situation to another. And ultimately, as a, ideally the perfect last step, it would be also a way to improve natural language understanding and create a system that would fully understand what we're trying to tell it, basically. So this is the takeaway message. This is amazing. You should all be doing this. And, obviously there's a lot of gaps in the science here, but, this is a very interesting idea that could have a huge impact. So I hope you are excited about this as well. If not, then, I can't, but, wish you all the best in figuring this out without this. But if you were interested in this, I wanted to do some shameless self-advertisement. We are doing a workshop in January. It's the 6th edition of the Image Schema Day. So we have had 5 editions before. It's amazing. I couldn't even count first. I thought it was like the 4th or something, but we have done a lot of these actually. It's usually a very friendly event where people come from very interdisciplinary backgrounds. So we invite people from every aspect of image schema research. It's usually not very big, but there's linguists there, there's artists, there are people from, of course, artificial intelligence and robotics and so on. So we tried to have a very sort of varied group here that is all interested in this one particular field. Submissions are very simple. There is a peer reviewing, but there are 2-page abstracts. There are, if you want to do something a bit more serious, you can submit full paper or extended abstracts of papers that has already been written and stuff like this. So mostly it's just a networking event, and we're just happy to have people coming to join us. So please consider that. Have a look at the website and send us a message if you're curious to join. This is mostly in case somebody has to see the slides, so you can have a look at the references that I've used here and some of the papers that were published within this sort of framework. And then I will just say thank you for your attention. I hope you have lots of interesting questions, and that I can also answer them. That's even more important, I guess. But anyway, thank you so much, and I hope you really enjoyed this.